I'm going to add some dissonance here, Lori, because your comment of the curve with the incremental improvement underneath it is hard to speak against. But at the same time, what I worry about, and I'm going to use a maintenance example. We had a point where we were working on how do we decrease the time of our outages. So how do you do work as quickly as possible, increase efficiency of getting your parts to the work site, increase efficiency of permit issuance. So all these different things that occur in an industrial facility. And then we had a separate team looking at how do you actually decrease the amount of turnarounds you do. So how do you increase the running interval in between? And these groups, which in theory are not necessarily operating with the same end, or the end in mind is less overall downtime, they actually have conflict points where to decrease the time of the turnaround, you do just a little bit less work. You don't hit things when you don't have to. But to increase the interval between turnarounds, you actually increase your scope and you take longer outages. And where I see things falling down is where you don't have that really strong integration layer. The person driving, what is the overall opportunity, and how do these two work streams, which are constructed to have tension, they're constructed to come into conflict, resolve those for an overall better outcome. And it's true in safety as well, Michael, I think, is you have different parts operating at different levels. And I like to use the example of reading while driving. You can't read and drive at the same time, at least not safely. And if you don't have people looking at those different horizons and allowed to look at those different horizons for an extended period of time, you actually end up in a situation where you either have no idea where you're going and you're actively iterating as fast as you can, or you're iterating with no direction. And so I guess my next question is, how do you see corporate structures or structure around change honor that need between transformation and incrementalism and bring them together so you're actually going for the same outcome at the end of the day?
In my opinion, if we unleash the power of the people, right? The reality is, if you think about process safety, when you ask somebody who's doing a job, how would you do it better, safer, differently? They 9 times out of 10 know how to do it better, safer, and differently, right? And so, so just tying back to process safety, that thinking process for me really gets into letting folks who know the work guide the work, improve the work, and then making sure there's a system around to make sure that that really happens and is not stifled by any means. Now, your question, which I think, Teresa, is a really good one, you know, how do you, as a corporation, think through the structure, and how do you enable transformation and incrementalism? And how do you do that in a way that leads to the same end goal? And for me, that's simple. I think being really clear about what the value is. So what am I valuing, and where do I see us heading from a vision standpoint? As Michael said, it can't just be the leaders, it's got to be the whole organization. And it has to be in really simple terms. It can't be a 20-point, 20-page PowerPoint. It's got to be, we're all going to get to million barrels equivalent, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Whatever that goal is and that value is, it needs to be really transparent. It needs to be on every door. It's got to be a simple saying. It's got to be something that everybody can repeat. And I think if there's a hyper focus on that value, transformational change as well as incremental change can work. Now, I do want to point out one thing just to get back to the types of change over a period of time. In my opinion, because that curve is going to be steep and we're all headed towards the energy transition, I don't think we can actually get through and thrive over the next decade with just incrementalism. I think that we need to think and let innovation happen differently. So let's go back to Michael's example and even yours a little bit. From a process safety standpoint or from a maintenance standpoint, instead of thinking specifically, how do we do that work differently? The question is, what other means are there to get the work done? So I have an example of where we needed a specific tool a few years ago, and it would have taken 3 weeks to design it, 4 weeks to do the drawings, 2 weeks to get the contract in place, and 2 months to get it across over to where it needed to be. And a young engineer said, let's just take the tool that we know works, scale it down and digitally print it. And that's what we did, right? And so just why do things the old way? And so encouraging that innovation, right? And we had the tool within like 6 or 7 days, and we were using it within 14. We had to test it in onshore or in shallow water first. And so just thinking through why do things just in, if we would have incrementalized the old process, we might have gotten to 4 months and off of a six month window. And the reality is, with hurricane season in the Gulf of Mexico, you don't have that time frame. So what can we do, and how do we do things differently, and how can we really encourage innovation? Hackathons, obviously, are an example of where pulling people together and really encouraging them to be transformational.
Jump in on 2 points that I think are so critical about what drove the transformational aspect of that tool development. One piece was the young engineer, somebody who didn't have the experience to say, you can't do it like this. So that concept of bringing in people who aren't burdened by experience, and I count myself as being burdened by my experience sometimes, where you have a known way of doing it and you don't necessarily think to look outside the box. But then the second piece is the time pressure, the hurricane season window. And I don't think we have the guts necessarily, or maybe the better way to put it is the impetus to try something new without that external pressure. So I guess maybe that's one reflection I take away is you need a mix of new ideas, challenging experience under circumstance where experience will say, yeah, okay, it's worth trying because the risk balance is different.
Yeah. And Teresa, that brings up very strongly the understanding of psychological safety.
Yeah.
There was a larger container in which that young engineer was able to speak up. And to me, that is one of the most fundamental conditions that we're currently wanting to put into place. But it's a lot harder to actually realize because, the same thing you're talking about in terms of, the likelihood that people just kind of maintain not only a status quo of thinking, but a status quo of relating to one another. So I imagine there was probably an older engineer in that context who was saying to themselves, or maybe even said out loud, but was overcome, that maybe that young person should just kind of stay in their place until they have the experience, and then they would be, qualified to be able to speak out in that context. Now, that didn't happen in that context, but I have seen that time and time and time again happen, which leads me to recognize that a lot of the work that is necessary to be able to orient to transformation is ensuring that psychological safety as a very foundational element of culture. It's not necessarily sophisticated. It is really, really basic. And yet it is probably the area of most common error that we show up in a context, we put out the boundary conditions, or we react to what's happening with a sense of defensiveness or even more overt emotion like anger or frustration when people speak of something that doesn't fit within our paradigm of understanding. And we've seen that in a number of cases in really high stakes situations where it took months for the idea to resurface because it was shot down with such anger and energy that it took a while for it to work into the system. And I guarantee you, the original speaker of it was probably not the person that brought it back because they were gun shy. They wouldn't speak up ever again after that kind of interaction. People, I believe sometimes people in power fail to recognize how their power impacts others who may be below them on the hierarchy. And it only takes one incident like that to diminish psychological safety for an individual or a group, if the group happened to be experiencing an incident like that.
Absolutely. And I think the link, and I'm going to pass this over to Lori because I think she could color in these lines pretty darn well. The link between psychological safety, mental health, human performance, and overall ability to change, to drive change, transformational or incremental, but the fast change being enabled by those underpinning currently quite trendy topics, I think is quite interesting.